And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. We have a very special guest tonight. Irina Tsukerman is a human rights lawyer and national security and geopolitical analyst, a graduate of Fordham University Law School. Her curriculum vitae includes over 10 years of work in human rights and national security issues. Currently, Attorney Tsukerman serves as the CEO of Scarab Rising, a media, critical communications, and security consultancy, and how we discovered her as the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, a website with a focus on niche issues in foreign policy, diplomacy, and intelligence. She's written for and commented for international and national media all over the world. Her writings have been translated to, well, dozens of languages, including Arabic, Farsi, Kurdish, Azerbaijani, Russian, Chinese, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and, well, even Indonesian and Turkish. In her spare time, Irina enjoys building internet cultural bridges among different communities in the U.S. as well as abroad. How her organization came to our attention. At a conference that took place at an event organized by the Yemeni Coalition of Independent Women in Geneva, just about a week or so ago on June 28th, on the sidelines of the 47th United Nations HCR session, Attorney Tsukerman described the Houthis as the most daring in their opposition to the basic rights and freedom of women and the practice of various means. Irina, Attorney Tsukerman, welcome to the Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Tonight we're gonna be taking a deep dive, if you will, into one of the, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, one of the four quadrants, one of the four significant groups involved in, almost without dispute, the single greatest humanitarian crisis on the planet today. And of course, we're talking about the Yemeni civil war. You've got a Saudi-led coalition that the United States is involved with at some level. You've got folks from Yemen who are revolting. You've got the population of Yemen itself. And of course, on top of everything else, you've got allegations, and I'll use that term loosely because there's considerable proof, of the involvement from Khomeini-like Iranian organizations. It's as complex as it gets. And in a sense, we'll spend a few minutes tonight, if you'll suffer along with us a little bit, in a little bit of what I call Yemen 101. And we've done this before, where we've had subject matter experts come on and just do sort of a base level analysis of some of these players, just to foster a greater level of understanding, particularly here in the United States, where it's largely played off as Saudis versus Yemeni patriots. And we all know that, as in every case, a patriot is often defined by what side of the field of battle you're on. Someone who is a rebel and a political dissident is described by what side of the battle or who you're involved with or where your natural inclination or support lies. And so it's critical that Americans just get a more fundamental understanding. But I want to spend at least a couple minutes talking about you, your organizations. Tell us a little bit about your background. You went to Fordham Law. How does one make the leap from Fordham Law, which is a great law school, into this tumultuous, chaotic world of international relations and human rights?
Well, thanks again, first of all, for inviting me. When I was in Fordham, I was already working on some national security issues. I was involved in organizations that were focused on the legal side of these issues. I was studying a lot of it academically. Having graduated, I was working as a regular lawyer, but at the same time, in my volunteer capacity, pursuing the same issues through ABA and other means, and increasingly volunteering my time as a lawyer for human rights organizations which matched various individuals in Western countries, journalists, human rights lawyers, activists, with individuals around the world who needed assistance in immigrating, escaping bad situations, who needed financial assistance or who needed media coverage for their situations, for their causes and activities. Over time, I started increasingly writing first about the cases I was handling, and then eventually providing more of a geopolitical analysis, and increasingly learning about the connection between security issues and human rights issues. I started heavily addressing disinformation, and actually some of my professional specialty became information warfare and the various ways state and non-state actors manipulate information and manipulate human rights situations and manipulate terminology to create appearances palatable to the public and promote these issues in Western press in their own ways. So that became a large focus on my work. I became drawn into work with different groups and organizations, focusing in large part on the Middle East and North Africa region. And eventually, I I moved from strictly legal practice towards more analytical and consulting capacity. Um, and I started providing media services as well after it became clear to me that many of these issues are underserved in the mainstream media, either by nature of general disinterest of the public and the nature of the media becoming increasingly shallow in their coverage of international relations, and also outright corruption of the media, which has become bought up by foreign actors and increasingly controlled in the way they cover conflicts and other international issues that often have the US domestic implications. Eventually, I opened my company, Scarab Rising, which provides services in media. It provides analytical reports. It provides intelligence and private intelligence and intelligence analysis, gathering and analysis, and security consulting as well as communication related services such as crisis communications and reputational management. Essentially, when somebody is attacked, when their reputation is damaged by smear campaigns, a very common issue in human rights, by the way. Uh, uh, this is where we come in. This is where I and my team can provide assistance with formulating and implementing a strategy in protecting oneself from such attacks. In addition, a lot of our services are also kind of public services. The Washington Outsider is connected to my company. It's a platform to address niche overlooked foreign policy, security, diplomacy issues, providing a more of an internal understanding of international relations, diplomatic issues, what goes on behind the headlines that we see in the papers, what are the real stories that do not get coverage. A lot of the times, state actors, including the U.S. government, but any government um, has an agenda in not really in covering up what goes on behind the scenes because it may be scandalous, sensitive, politically inconvenient, or simply too complicated to really present to the general public. This is where we come in and try to dig in. We provide these sort of investigations and um, analysis coming from our direct experience in the countries where which we cover. Uh, it's not that we are necessarily muckrakers just for the sake of causing scandals, but we are seeking to provide an understanding of issues that can help the public understand when they're being lied to, quite honestly, and being deliberately misinformed or deceived, sometimes by states, sometimes by the media itself, sometimes by lobbies who have an interest in prolonging certain conflicts, certain issues, because that's how they make money. So we go against a lot of the times we go against the general consensus on these issues and against the mainstream narratives that you will hear from even very reputable think tanks. A lot of the times everything you hear about a particular issue comes uh, from only a couple of sets of actors, and you generally hear the same set of talking points over and over again. Not because that set of talking points is necessarily accurate, not necessarily because it's always true, or even convenient, but sometimes that's just because that's what was generated by some lobby group, by some consultancy somewhere, and this is what's being recycled over and over again. And what really goes on is anybody's guess. And we provide that, we dig beyond the headlines. Sometimes people don't like it. Sometimes it makes it difficult to publish elsewhere, and that's why we created our own platform. That way, you can't shut down an investigation. You can't not publish something that we've decided to publish its own platform. And we also welcome other voices. We welcome contributors with interests and interesting perspectives and analysis that escapes the general public. A lot of the times, some of the most interesting perspectives are not widely seen, not because necessarily of censorship, but because um, there is no demand for those perspectives, or at least the editors, publishers, producers don't believe there would be a demand, but we are willing to give them a platform, and people surprise us. People are often tired of hearing the same stories over and over again. They want fresh information. They want to hear from different people around the world, and they are tired of being told what they need to hear about versus what they may want to hear about. So it's up to them whether to read it or not, but at least they have that option. And we seek to uncover rather than hide. That's our mission.
I'm curious your perspective of the American media. One of the challenges that we apparently face is what I lovingly refer to as short attention span theater. You match that up with if you remember back to the movie Wag the Dog with Dustin Hoffman, where literally an alternate reality was created for purposes of obscuring a scandal. There doesn't appear to be a lot of appetite. And again, is this a self-fulfilling prophecy because of at the level that the press ignores issues like Yemen? But what is there, or what could be done to stimulate an appetite for these incredible issues that are happening, this incredible history that's taking place literally as you and I chat tonight? How bad is it, and what can be done?
Well, there's a couple of factors. One, it is a self fulfilling prophecy, just like dumbing down education in schools or anywhere else is a self fulfilling prophecy. If you tell people that they are too stupid to comprehend something, they will act as if they are. It will kill their intellectual curiosity, and they will feel increasing lack of interest and capacity for learning. Similarly, with international issues, if you tell people you don't need to know that, just don't worry your pretty little heads with this complicated information. Your betters in the government always know best. And to be honest with you, decades of failed foreign policy by the same Beltway geniuses have convinced me that actually I believe the public would be better served with having more information rather than less, and maybe then they can make more informed decisions about what issues they support, consider important, and who they select to office. And it's not impossible, just as it's possible to introduce worse standards, it's equally possible to introduce better standards, to hold people to those higher standards, to provide them information, and people will come, people will start reading, they will react. You may not get a million people reading that article, but you may find yourself being surprised by who is reading it. And over the course of interaction on social media with people from every imaginable background from across the country and from across the world, I am astonished by the fact that the single biggest piece of disinformation that has been fed to us is that people are too stupid to know, that people don't want to know and don't need to know. That is not true. People from every background, every education level want to connect to other human beings. They want to connect to the world outside of them. Sometimes they may be too tired to search for the information or to dig through piles of misinformation and layers of manipulative presentations, but they want to know. They are curious about how other people live, they're curious about the human condition, and they feel compassion for other people, even if they don't always know what to do about it. So people surprise me. Um, I think what's important is not always quantifiable in numbers. Right now, presentation of the media has become all about the number of clicks, and therefore one should ask oneself: is it really that the public doesn't want to know, or is it just that the media finds itself lacking a business model that can generate income based on providing in-depth information to the public? Because in the time that somebody takes to read a long form essay about foreign policy, they could click on 10 or 15 or 20 clickbait fluff pieces and generate a lot more income for the media. So the question is it really that people are so isolated from information, so disinterested, or is it that they're being forced to be disinterested because it's more financially viable for those who are presenting that information?
Right, particularly since the business model with the American media has shifted completely onto the net. And just as an aside, the frustration there, if you're an independent media person here in America, is that the big networks, the NBC, the CBS, the ABC, the legacy networks, we'll say, were granted a near exclusive to the airwaves, the all-powerful television airwaves. In exchange, the quid pro quo, if you will, was that they would present dedicated resources, assumed to be money-losing, by the way, towards covering the news. That was part of the grand bargain. And it's apparent to anyone at this point that that little bit of the bargain has been forgotten, and that's both on radio and television. Now, if there's any upside to it, and, I wouldn't pretend to be on the same level as your organizations are, but the coalition was founded out of frustration because no one wanted to handle what we call here the third rail issues, the really uncomfortable conversations, about civil rights, about humanitarian rights, about the anti-war movement, about all of these composite issues. So you just, if there's any blessing to this, it's that organizations like yours, from big to small, have decided to invest and create their own media hubs. And I think about organizations as diverse as AIER, FEE, the Goldwater Group, which are focused on more small business economics and economic freedoms, but that's across all boundaries. And so it's the challenge, of course, is particularly the smaller and very often more brash organizations getting word to people that these other alternatives exist, that you don't have to go to CNN, you don't have to go to Fox News. You can go directly to organizations like yourself who have a hyper focus on different but incredibly important issues around the globe. And you get firsthand reporting, firsthand analysis, subject matter expertise, and that's the beauty of it. So it's just a question, I think, of getting the word out that organizations like yours exist who are, again, hyper-focused on arguably one of the great challenges on the planet today, and that's what's happening in Yemen. And it's, this quilt work, this crazy patchwork of organizations that are associated with each other are emblematic of so many other global situations. You've got, and it's not black and white anymore, it's shades of gray. So I'm so grateful for what the work that you folks do, and not just the quality work, but the spirit that you bring to it, because someone, somewhere, particularly on issues like this, have to buck, if you will, the conventional wisdom and just present facts and present, firsthand analysis. Let's talk about Yemen and how we got there. And again, like most Americans, this is my little bit here is going to be a superficial analysis, and I'm going to ask you to really focus on if you will, the issues surrounding the rebels and how we got here. There was a long-term Yemeni president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Uh, we get to the Arab Spring of 2011, and let's think of that for a moment. We're literally in the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and yet it seems like it was mere months ago. It's astonishing what's happened since then, yet how important that was. Many people, like in so many parts of the Middle East, are starting to rise up against oppressive governments. Saudi Arabia, in large part, creates something called the Gulf Cooperation Council. They oversee negotiations that forced out Saleh with his 20-year regime. And that begins sort of a third generation, if you will, of politics and geopolitics that infect and attack the very root of the Yemeni people. What happened at that point? I know, and again, I'm oversimplifying it. You've got a Shiite movement that's largely, as we're told, backed by Iran. You've got Saudi Arabia being accused by many of creating a client state or attempting to create a client state in Yemen. You've got Americans supporting at a large scale the weaponry, particularly through an American corporation called Raytheon, who's made a whole lot of dough for a lot of people suffering. And of course, you've got the Iranians, the claim that the Iranians through Hezbollah are training and actively arming and if you will, the rebels. Is that accurate? Can you make sense out of all this for us?
Well, let's go back and start from the beginning. Yemen's problems did not start recently. There was a there were conditions that these groups took advantage of that go back to the 1960s to Nasserist Egypt invading the country and attempting to impose the proto-communist vision on Yemen. Houthis at the time were not a radical group at all. They were Shia leaning. They were a form of Shia called Zaidi, but they were backed by the Saudis against the Nasserist threat. Essentially, Yemen ended up being split into countries. A prosperous south that was leaning towards Saudis and more pro-Western, and where most of the oil deposits were found, and the north that was poor, underdeveloped, and um, essentially where some of these ideologies proliferated. Um, in in 1979, after the Islamic Revolution in Iran started exporting the Khomeinist version of Shia Islam around the world. At first, slowly, because they did not have the financial resources to do so. They were facing internal crackdowns. They were later drawn into the war with Iraq that was quite devastating. So, initial efforts were not particularly significant, but were seen as a threat by Arab states in the region, which at that point formed the GCC to counter specifically the Iran threat. The GCC itself was split for many reasons. Oman, for instance, had close ties to Iran. Ideologically, it was also more of a Shia state, and territorially, Qatar too was trying to play all sides, even though it was part of the GCC. So they've had many internal issues, and Iran later was able to take advantage of that. Houthi radicalization started in the 90s and not recently, as many believe. Even going back to late 80s, they did have much earlier contacts with the Islamic Republic than most people believe. But in additionally, they looked back to some of the history of Yemen that and adopted some of the more radical principles from the past. And people don't really, many people may not know, but Houthis, the name for the group comes from a family. It's a clan that actually has some of its roots in Persia and has adopted a very radical ideology, pushing a sense of kind of lineage superiority um, uh, that's ends up being very sectarian, very racist against other families that are of that do not come from the lineage going back to Prophet Muhammad, and started imposing laws that were previously practiced at different points in history in Yemen on their first initially on their own clan, and once they were able to get to power on the rest of the country. Uh, there was, of course, a lot of corruption, as it you know in Yemen as in the rest of the region, but quite frankly, Houthis, once they started gravitating towards a more radical ideology, played a part in the same corruption. They were smuggling weapons across the Omani border for decades. Iran was training them in intelligence gathering, in defense techniques. Um, Iran had a very long term vision for the region. It prioritized the exploitation of revolutionary principles above all else, and it saw itself as a theological rival to Saudi Arabia. But of course, because most of the people in the region are Sunni, and Saudi Arabia is a custodian of the two holy mosques, Iran on its own stood no chance of directly imposing itself and being kind of a substitute for Riyadh. Instead, they worked by arming, training, and ideologically co-opting various dissatisfied groups. Some of them Shia, others were Sunni. They did focus mostly on groups that were more ideologically similar to themselves. But eventually, they came to work with anyone who was willing to cooperate with them and corrupted them through money, through promises of power, and so forth. It was a long process. It was not always visible. The Houthi groups became the Houthi group from one family started expanding across the north of Yemen by marrying into other clans very strategically and expanding its ties through family relations and promising power to groups from particular lineages, promising them wealth, and co-opting these groups in these um, underdeveloped areas that lacked natural resources, mostly in the north, and essentially co-opting them ideologically as well as through financial promises. Houthis had a series of clashes with the rest of Yemen throughout the 21st century, um, building up to the civil war, which broke out with the Houthi uprising in 2014, by which point, after a series of clashes that showed substantial growth in their strength, in their ability to defend themselves and co-opt territories, and after Hezbollah and IRGC actors came to Yemen and actually actively trained the Houthi leadership and their recruits, they started to adapt sophisticated training techniques. They became more sophisticated over time. Before 2018, analysts were divided whether the Houthi clans, which formed a political party called Ansar Allah, whether they were a proxy, a militia backed by Iran, or were they an independent actor that was partnering with Iran? And over time, that relationship shifted from a partnership of strategic interests to being increasingly co opted um, by Iran through ideology, through resources, through control, and through the numbers of IRGC and the agents that came directly to Yemen from people in training capacity to increasingly more senior officials. So over time, their role shifted. And in 2014, when they rose up against Saleh's regime, they were attacking the rest of the country. Now, the rest of the country had, of course, its own tribal sectarian problems. There was the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, um, a party called Al Isla, which to some extent had its differences with the Houthis, but also to some extent was willing to cooperate with them. And that party itself had its own internal issues. There were other Yemenis, some of them were separatists and wanted to secede from the north completely because they believed that the north Yemen was the part of the country filled with all these radical problems and economic issues and had nothing to offer. And the South Yemen, when it was independent, was more prosperous and didn't have those issues. They gravitated more towards UAE. Then you had a mixture of assorted other Yemenis who were quite fine with the way things were, but just didn't want the Houthi uprising to be an issue, and they gravitated closer to Saudi Arabia. So it became a complicated conflict. In 2015, the Yemen government the actually asked Saudi Arabia to intervene in Yemen. The Yemen government um, literally could not face the uprising on its own, and most of the country at that point still was not under the control of the Houthis at all. So when people believe that Saudis are waging a war against Yemen, it's completely incorrect. It's complete disinformation coming from northern groups under Houthi control. Not all of them, by the way, support Houthis, but many of them have been indoctrinated by the Houthis in from through complete control of the media, information, schooling, and so forth. The situation became quite disastrous. The United States entered the picture not as a primary assistance in putting down the rebellion, as many Iranians believe, but in fighting Al Qaeda um, and other radical groups such as ISIS that entered the picture once the civil conflict broke out. Saudi coalition is the Yemen government is actually part of the Saudi-led coalition. Um, and they're working jointly to counter this problem. Now, that's not to say that there aren't internal differences over strategy, but Yemenis follow their own government, and Houthis have been able to assert ideological influence, but a lot of it has been done by completely illegitimate means. So they were able to gain control of the popular mindset in the north, especially where 70% of the population reside, but through propaganda, complete information control, bribery, force, disinformation, ideological manipulation. The Houthis do not recognize the United States as a state. They have the same vision of the U.S. as Iran does, as an enemy to be destroyed. They view Israel the same way as a country that has no legitimacy and should not exist. They view Jews and other minorities as people who are not, contrary to most mainstream Islamic teachings, a protected class or people of the book, but as an enemy. Their slogan actually includes cursing the Jews, and they have put they have given death penalty to Baha'i, and they've persecuted very small. They've persecuted Christians who've migrated to Yemen or who lived in Yemen all along. It has been quite a, and they've been also imposing a vision of racial and tribal superiority over the rest of Yemen, which has not been taken kindly by Yemenis, imposing special taxes on Yemenis who do not come from the lineage of Prophet Muhammad, imposing taxes on prayer times, separating people by groups, creating separations between men and women that were far more radical than anything that was culturally appropriate in Yemen or traditional or even practiced in most observant Muslim families. And as I've pointed out in my presentation in Geneva, with respect to women, they followed the Khomeinist model, not even the traditional tribal model of Yemen, which treats women as second-class citizens with no legitimate public role. And from mere kind of perfunctory modesty requirements, they're imposing increasingly restrictive dress codes, and actually they're proud of going beyond what is practiced in Iran, where women can be arrested, thrown in prison, or beaten for not covering their hair, into actually entering people's private homes, training groups to enter homes and inspecting their clothing to make sure that they dress appropriately even in the privacy of their own harm that goes far beyond what happens even in Iran. It's unheard of, but it's spreading. So the big picture here is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding, that there is a belief that there is a that Houthis are kind of completely distinct from Iran. In fact, they're increasingly being taken over by Iran. Iran sent its own ambassador to Sana'a, who has believed to come in illegally through Oman borders into the country. And humanitarian organizations based in Yemen went to see that ambassador rather than Houthi representatives following his appearance, which indicates that there is increasing understanding that Iran is playing the primary governance role in the territories controlled by the Houthis, um, and uh, and Houthis are relegated to secondary roles. They've played out their function of gaining control of the territory and creating divisions among the rest of the Yemenis sufficient for Iran to enter the picture. Now the question is, why does Iran need a failed state um, that is divided, that's in the midst of the crisis? Why would they want to govern something like that? Why would they want to continue fighting over the territory, such as the strategic area called Marib? If it were to fall, that's considered to be the last stronghold of the Saudi coalition. What is Iran gaining out of creating another failed state like Lebanon, where the resources have are going outside the country, where there's increasing drug trafficking as a money making scheme by the Houthis, where there are electricity shortages, blackouts. Why anyone would want to govern such a territory? What's there? Yemen to Iran is not, the Yemeni people to Iran do not matter. Even ideological influence here is secondary to the primary goal of using Yemen as a launching pad for the rest of the region. First of all, Iran has been needs resources financially, economically. It needs resources after years of restrictive sanctions. It's looking to gain control of additional oil fields and so forth. If Marib is to fall and Saudis are forced out of Yemen, Iran gains control of those strategic lands and of those resources which it needs for its own survival as a regime.
Hmm.
Second, Yemen has been a place to experiment with new weapons, and there's been a record of Houthis gaining access to increasingly sophisticated missiles, drones, and other types of weapons. They're experimental and they're used to attack Saudi Arabia, UAE. Recently, the Houthis volunteered to assist Hamas in its conflict with Israel. Hamas rejected that aid, but continued other forms of cooperation, even Bahraini fishing boats. So all these weapons are being used, they're being implemented, and they're creating a situation where Yemen is a strategic location for Iran to attack other countries that are of more long-term value and interest, especially Saudi Arabia because of the closeness of the borders. There's a there's also a reason why Iran has trained the Houthis in particular in a landmine strategy, very sophisticated strategy. The landmines in Yemen go back to the 60s, to the Soviet use of landmines, quite strategic as well. But Iran has perfected the strategy, and Houthis have managed to gain a great deal of territorial access by planting landmines everywhere up to the borders with Saudi Arabia, creating a huge crisis, costing lives and limbs to civilians, and making it exceptionally difficult to remove those landmines from the territory. Those landmines are aimed at harming civilians, aimed at creating maximizing the number of civilian casualties. They're not aimed simply at military vehicles and such. It's a strategy of deliberately terrorizing civilians and making life impossible for civilians. Similarly, a lot of other strategies that the Houthis have learned from Iran reflect those used by other Iranian proxies around the world. The and they're used to terrorize and to subdue the population and to essentially create take over populations that are not willing to put up with their ideology. Essentially, they take child soldiers from the villages that are particularly rebellious. It's a strategic move. They use child soldiers and separate them from their families. They break them down. They sometimes entice them with drugs, and sometimes they take them by force, or sometimes they just manipulate them, or they offer their families money, or they offer to give them education in a, but ultimately brainwash and train them in some training camps, use them for a variety of functions, sometimes
Right.
as cannon fodder, but sometimes to they grow them into particularly vicious soldiers, but many of them die as young teenagers long before they um they reach that level, and they create generations of fanatics that are addicted to drugs and that are fierce in battle and don't ask questions, and they subdue the population of Yemenis, and that's how they create ideological following. Recently, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, Leather King, said that Houthis have legitimacy in Yemen. What he meant was that they do have that they enjoy popularity among the people, but that popularity is imposed. It's not a popularity of people making a rational, educated choice, or at least having an access to the means to make that choice if they should wish. It's imposed on them. So there's the popularity is the popularity of a completely indoctrinated population that cannot ask any questions, either due to drug use, to ideological manipulation, to indoctrination, or force. Those are the four methods used by the Houthis to create a very coherent following in the north, and increasingly pushing beyond the north to the areas and challenging the areas controlled by the coalition, and spreading hatred against outsiders.
Mhm.
And by outsiders, it's increasingly not just Americans, Israelis, Jews, but especially, of course, Saudis, other Yemenis who do not follow the same path, and even particular families and clans. It's a strategy of dividing and conquering, like Iran employs within its own borders. It's based on hatred, not any kind of positive vision for the country. There is no positive vision. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse in every respect. Houthis, for instance, led raids against hospitals at the peak of the COVID pandemic, while the country was also suffering from multiple other medical issues such as cholera epidemic and dysentery and others,
Right.
leaving nothing for the populations living under their control. So and they've diverted millions in humanitarian aid, and either sold it off or redistributed it to their followers and favorite clans and leadership, leaving nothing for many of the people living under their control. So it's a nasty situation where you can always say, well, they have popular following, but who is really following them? There's no equality in the society. There is no real freedom of choice. There's manipulation, divisions, and intermarriages that make it difficult for the families to leave, even if individuals within
Right.
those families don't like what's going on.
Now, question for you: as is typical, um, the American foreign policy response to this has been schizophrenic at best. In the last few months, we've seen Americans under the Biden administration talk about ceasing the delivery of offensive weapons to the Saudis. Simultaneously, the Houthis, if you will, their terrorist status imposed by the Trump administration was revoked. Yet at the same time, just probably about 5 or 6 weeks ago, a special envoy to the region, Mr. Linneking, talked about reestablishing, if you will, embargoes and limitations, if you will, on the Houthi military officials who were in the Marib region, primarily chasing, if you will, the natural gas function that's there. And again, so much of Eastern Europe, Middle Eastern geopolitics are not just oil driven, but increasingly natural gas driven. So Americans, we obviously we tend to try to boil it down to black and white, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, but it seems like you've got and your particular focus is on the quote unquote rebels or terrorists, depending again who you talk to. But we've had a similar onslaught of information about the volume of bombing raids that have been led by the by the Saudi, yikes, the Saudi coalition. So do the Yemeni people just simply find themselves in the middle of this, and I'll use a term that's grotesquely abused, proxy war? Do they find themselves as the unfortunate, and again, I'm understating there, unfortunate hosts for a proxy war between two nation states that have a strong fundamentalist religious role in them, and they are just getting beaten from both sides? Do you find any culpability in the Saudi side of this as well? Where do Americans go? I'm sorry, go ahead,
I would say that this is a completely inaccurate comparison. I would say the comparison that people use in that respect is the same as some people have tried to use against the Nazi Axis during Second World War and the coalition of allies.
Right.
The coalition, the U.S., Soviet, UK triumvirate was certainly not perfect. There've been things that happened during the war. There's always war crimes during the war. Nobody's going to deny that. But let's face it, what would have been the alternative? Complete takeover of Europe by the Nazis, completely unacceptable. This is the situation here. The Houthi ideology and the Khomeiniist ideology are literally a reflection of very much Nazi-like principles, ISIS-like principles. The human rights record is similar. Saudi Arabia in the past has certainly been driven by radical ideas, which, by the way, were fully endorsed by the West during the Cold War. That was why they were there to begin with. In recent years, they have taken a great deal of time and effort to reform a lot of this, to stop an exportation of ideologies that are considered extreme, violent, and hateful. A lot of and their presence in Yemen is to a large part defensive because the Houthis have been attacking Saudi borders, and they've been waging both economic and terrorist warfare against the Saudis, attacking the Aramco sites, but also civilian sites, killing and injuring civilians who are not combatants within Saudi territories. As well as they were asked, as I said, by the Yemen government to intervene, which makes them a partner to the Yemen government and not a proxy manipulator. They are a stronger state, they are better organized than Yemen, but that does not make them a user of proxies, that makes them a partner in the coalition. Perhaps even a leader of the coalition, but still one with a legitimate role to play. They have also invested over $16 billion into humanitarian activities in the territories that the coalition controls through the King Salman Relief Center, Relief and Humanitarian Aid Center, through projects such as Masam, which are landmine removal projects that remove the landmines from the territories where it's possible to get access to, which had been planted by the Houthis, and who provide medical aid and supplies to the civilians in the area. That is not how a proxy manipulator acts. That is a humanitarian investment of a huge amount of resources. You may say they're not always great at managing things. They've made tactical mistakes during specific operations. That's all fair. Those are all fair points. But the goals here are completely different. The approach is different. The mentality is different, and there's no attempt to impose a particular violent vision on the region. Iran actually is doing specifically that. It's
Hmm.
exporting revolution abroad, and you cannot draw those comparisons. You could say, well, those specific individuals committed war crimes, they should be punished. That's fair. Saying that the country is similar to Iran is not. They're moving in completely different directions.
This is it's an astonishing conversation because I don't know. I consider myself a student of history uh, who's become an increasing cynic over the last generation or so as I've gotten older, uh, because of the not just the violence that's occurring in the region, but the violent clashes, if you will, of perspectives that's taking place in the region. Because if you were to, the current narrative in the United States is that, in fact, the Saudis are very often the center of intransigence. The Saudis are the ones leading, uh, if you will, these airstrikes on an innocent population, and that's a lot of the material that you brought to this seminar, held in conjunction with, if you will, the timing of which was identical to the UN uh, human rights seminar. You're very specific in your allegations in the attacks on women that have taken place. I mean, uh, I know you touched on that briefly, but maybe you can go into a little bit more detail on that. And I mean, Americans tend to seize on some of the gorier issues. I mean, we're talking about honor killings, genital mutilations. That's the portrait that's often painted of an ISIS-led or an ISIS-style occupation. Are you is you know mass rapes, issues like that? Is that what's happening here under the head,
These are
if you will, of the guidance of the the Houthi rebels?
absolutely, and calling them rebels at this point is a misnomer, because while they may have started as a rebellious group, now first of all they control over 70% of the population in Yemen, so that's hardly a rebellion. Second, they're being backed by a foreign state, so that makes them at best more of a militia.
Mm-hmm.
And third, they're engaging in terrorist tactics. They're taking human beings hostage and making it impossible to just strike military foundations. The terrain in Yemen is quite mountainous. They're taking advantage of that. Like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and other Iranian proxies, they have used civilian buildings, schools, hospitals, uh, mosques, unfortunately, as sites for weapon storage, and they brought in civilians and used them as human shields, making it impossible to avoid strikes and collateral damage and the killing of innocent people. With women, they haven't just been going after human rights activists and outspoken critics of their political structure. They've been abducting women off the street, raping them. Sometimes they use their attire that they're not sufficiently modest enough. Or sometimes these women just happen to be public figures with careers and they're being abducted for that. And they've taken women with young children into prisons, and the children are there with their mothers, and there are systematic rapes, tortures, beatings, and smear campaigns against these women that affect their entire communities. Remember, Yemen is a
Right.
Muslim, relatively conservative country, destroying women's reputations and imputing sexual indiscretions to them, and damaging their reputations is destructive to the entire family, the entire community. It creates divisions. It creates questions about the lineage of the children who are born as a result. It's and it's destructive to the women. It destroys their
Mm-hmm.
role in the community. Their role traditionally in Yemen has been quite elevated. They were centers of the communal life. They were transmitters of traditional and religious values to the family. They were involved in the community life to a great extent. They were visible and colorful, and uh, and enjoy and was a great deal and played a great deal of a cultural role in traditional celebrations and educational role and things like that. And now they're being erased from the public sphere. Their faces are being erased. They're being treated as subhumans. They're being treated the way ISIS treats Yazidi slaves, sexual
Right.
slaves. They're essentially treating women as objects. There's a complete dehumanization that's going on. It's not mere restrictions, it's not mere imposition of modesty codes or things women are not allowed to do. It's any woman can be dragged off the street and forced to commit a crime, or forced or thrown in prison, disappeared, raped, or be taken as a sex slave to a Houthi leader. There is no rule of law that's applicable. There are no standards. It's completely arbitrary treatment of women as objects. That's a completely separate level of anything you can see anywhere else. This is somewhat similar to what you see Taliban is doing, and to definitely what ISIS is doing. Otherwise, there's no comparisons. Even goes beyond what Iran itself is doing, far beyond that.
What do you see? We only got a few minutes left, but what do you see as the role, or should be the role, of American foreign policy, given this and this the big picture that you painted for us today?
US has tried to stay out of the main conflict, but the reality is it cannot. It cannot keep chasing Iran and appeasing Iran and hoping that by ignoring these violent episodes somewhere else it can somehow win some advantage in the long run. There is no long run. For Iran, this is the goal. The nuclear bomb is just an additional deterrent against enemies, but it already has everything it needs to do to destroy half the world with the number of ballistic missiles in control of Hezbollah and increasingly now in the control of the Houthis. So US should realize its own interest in the matter, that its interest in stopping this ideology from spreading. It's not about state building, it's not about democracy, it's not about anything other than preventing a humongous security disaster for everybody. This is a global issue. It's not limited to some conflict between some unknown groups. The
Right.
Houthis use financial resources of the entire financial system of the West. They travel to the United States. They establish the centers in the U.S. to recruit people in the Yemeni communities in the U.S. to spread propaganda. They lobby with Iranian money and with other money. They lobby Congress. They enter educational systems in U.S. universities. They on par with other state actors like Qatar, like Muslim Brotherhood. They launch political campaigns in the media. They create a propagation of a violent, anti-Semitic, anti-American, and anti-minorities, anti-homosexual, and anti-women's ideology that seeps through their allies here in the United States. This is anti-America. This is against everything we stand for. This is against basic human freedoms, against human dignity. We are creating a fifth column by allowing this ideology to proliferate, and it's not going to stop if just because if we don't get involved in Yemen. Say, well, that's not our concern. We can't spend our resources there. Unfortunately, this is not how Iran and its proxies view the situation. They see it as a total war for complete domination of the sphere, um, of the ideological sphere, and they believe that they should be using every means possible, political, ideological, military, every means at their disposal to impose their ideology, to export their ideology, to win influence and to gain traction and gain control of every sphere that they can. So this is a direct threat to us, to our way of life. And by allowing distraction to spread from Yemen elsewhere, we are seeing already they are creating an issue with international maritime trade. Oil and gas is at risk passing through the Strait of Hormuz. We are seeing the US allies in the region being attacked. We are seeing the network of Iranian proxies becoming integrated and acting in concert already. There is a cooperation between Houthis and Hamas. Houthis were trained by Hezbollah. All these groups are becoming more global. Houthis are involved in international drug trafficking, which they didn't used to be. So these bad actors are sharing intelligence, they're sharing best practices. Hezbollah is already inside the US and in Latin America. These security issues are coming to us. If we don't stop them at their root, they will come and get us here. And as they already are. It's a global issue. It should be seen as part of a global fight, not against terrorism, because terrorism is a tactic, and I've never seen a worse approach to security than by calling it a war on terrorism. It's a meaningless term, but against ideology that threatens our civilization, our way of life, our constitution, our freedom, our human dignity, and our conscience.
Right now, as we speak, and it's largely uncovered by the Western media, there appears to be massive strikes taking place in Iran. And I juxtapose that coverage with what's going on with Cuba. I salute all those who are brave enough to literally put their lives on the line to fight that type of dictatorship, that type of submission of human rights, those type of atrocities. Why? In closing, we've kind of brought this full circle. Clearly, Cuba strikes at the imagination of Americans. There's a strong Cuban presence, obviously, in Florida that's been quite emotional over the years in their opposition to the Castro regime. But in the case of Iran, this is the second or third go-around where people have risen up against an oppressive regime. Part of me wants to be a pacifist and a little bit of an isolationist, but should people of conscience be doing a better job to support the people in Iran who are willing to literally put their lives at stake and fight this type of government?
I believe that whatever financial advantage the current backers, Western backers of the regime, think they are getting out of trading with a completely illegitimate entity that usurped power and has created numerous divisions and destruction in the region, whatever financial advantage they think they can get from out of that, the advantage of dealing with a prosperous and free Iran is significantly greater. That doesn't mean that we should start just starts poorly planned attacks with groups with disparate groups without any sort of strategy. I'm not advocating that at all, but I am suggesting at the very least not empowering an adversary that is seeking our destruction at the end of the day.
Right.
That is not going to be from a financially viable model. It's not going to empower anybody's freedom. It's going to come and destroy us, as we have seen things like that backfire tremendously around the world throughout history. So we should be lending whatever moral and political backing to the people who want to take their own destiny into their own hands and not get in their way. That's the least we can do, not empowering these actors that have done nothing but create destruction. What have they actually contributed to us that is of our use? They cannot even refine oil. They're corrupt to the point of not being able to manage anything. The companies doing business in Iran, they're losing money and they have to deal with extreme level of corruption there.
Right.
So we're not gaining anything financially from backing Iran or from doing business with the current regime. It's harming our interests. It's harming our financial self-interest, and it's certainly harming our security and any basic respect for freedom that any human beings would have. Yes, maybe we shouldn't fight somebody else's fight, but we shouldn't also fight against them either, which is what we're doing right now.
Understood. Well, there's so much more to talk about, and I hope you'll continue to join us on the Coalition airwaves because you bring a valuable perspective to the conversation, to the argument. before we sign off for the night, let's remind folks of where they can find your work, where they can find you and your co-workers' writings on the web, as well as in the business world.
Well, you're always welcome to visit the Washington Outsider. It's currently the website at thewo.us, but we are also getting we are in the middle of redesigning, which should be complete in a couple of days. So we will have also the website thewo.news. Scarab Rising is spelled exactly as it sounds. Scarab Rising .com. That's my professional. That's the website with the services that my company offers, and of course on social media I'm quite active, especially on Twitter, and that's where I engage in discussions, share both the articles posted on the website and those from other people, share my own media appearances, and if you want to contribute to the Washington Outsider, you are welcome to email me or to message me on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and send in your work. My email is sicat222@gmail.com. You can send your articles there for our consideration, and of course through social media as well.
Wonderful. Irina Tsukerman, Attorney Zuckerman, if you will. Thank you so much for joining us. And as events dictate over the coming weeks, days, months, I hope you'll rejoin us and you or the folks that you work with at the variety of efforts that you have going on. It's critical that independent media like yours take advantage of, if you will, of outlets like us to provide let's just say reasoned opposition to the in-place narrative, and to provide facts and perspective in an environment where we have so little. And yet, as I said at the onset of the show, as we stand right now, one of the great, if you will, humanitarian debacles, tragedies is taking place. And yet the perspective over here in the United States, not to try and be fashionably trite and critical, as is so easy to do in the case of American society, but to make a poignant reminder that there's a whole wide world that's filled with pain right now. And we can't ignore it. We can't be ignorant of it. We need to embrace it and try to find solutions. We are the coalition.
Thank you so much.
No worries. We are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. We're signing off for this evening. We'll be back tomorrow night. We're on the air now 5 nights a week, Monday through Friday, with a host of wonderful shows, as well as, well, conversations like this interspersed throughout. We'll see you soon. Good night.